doing things with language and with difficult knowledge and with narrative that literally make my heart beat faster. There's this curiously joyous thing that art does of stimulating minds and bodies, even when it's with painful knowledge or insights, by kind of offering forms or shapes for better ways of knowing. I just have to click the continue because it's telling me I'm being recorded. There we are. On the subject of knowing, I am very aware that the idea of a keynote sends out messages about knowledge and authority. And I'm very aware that my Cambridge room in the background exacerbates that. And obviously, I've been reading and thinking about the contemporary writing that we're going to be discussing at this conference only for as long as you all have. I mean, Adesraum was published this year. We've all been thinking about it since then. 2017 was published last year. And I'm also very aware that as a white British person, I have a lot less knowledge than some of you in some of the key areas of experience that the writing speaks to and about. But the keynote's also a metaphor. And even though a musical keynote is pretty uninteresting by itself, it becomes interesting when other notes get added. And there are obvious resonances between my focus on Sharon Dodua Otoo's and Olivia Wenzel's novels and the papers that Alrik Daldrup and Isabel Sluka are going to be giving later today. And I'm excited about having those conversations. And I'm also excited about Leah Laura Heim's focus on Fatma Aydemir and the Bildungsroman. I actually think Wenzel's and Otoo's novels also have a playful and subversive relationship with that very German literary form. And I'm fascinated by Laura Maria Sturz's metaphors of the root and the rhizome, and really looking forward to Jeanette Holy's and Joseph Kagan-Gamer's analysis of identity discourses. Among other things, this conference is bringing to the table the problem that only some kinds of identity are marked as identity. And one of the things I want to explore in this paper is how conservative identity politics violently shore up their own empoweredness, while generally managing to stay invisible as identity politics to themselves and others. So I'm going to screen share, I hope. My host has disabled screen sharing. Can you enable me?
Sorry, just a second. I will enable you shortly.
Thank you. Sorry, I should have asked you before we started. I didn't remember.
That's fine, sorry.
Okay, I seem to be enabled. We're great.
Is that good now? Okay, sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay.
Yes, somebody nod to show me it's working. Great, thank you. So, Practice of Possibility, Wayward Aesthetics in 2017, Angst and Adesraum. So what I think is the spirit of many of the papers today, I want to focus on the radical importance of form in Sharon Otoo's and Olivia Wenzel's literary production, and on the excitement of an aesthetics that exceeds the ideological confines of its moment. So in that sense, a wayward aesthetics. And I'm borrowing the idea of waywardness from Saidiya Hartman in Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, where she says waywardness is a practice of possibility, which I borrowed from my title, and an ongoing experiment of what might be. So in particular, I want to explore how both 2017 and Angst and Adesraum model a kind of storytelling that both disrupts linear chronology and is insurrectionary in grammatical mood, exposing a politically fossilizing indicative, so this is how it was or is and always will be, and replacing it with subjunctives of possibility. This is how it could have been or might yet be. And I'm inspired actually by Anthony Reid, whose brilliant study of poetics, Freedom Time, explores a literary aesthetics of time. And he begins with Michael Hanschard's analysis of racial time, which describes unequal temporal access to institutions, goods, services, resources, power, and knowledge that results from power relations between racially dominant and subordinate groups. Reid transforms Hanschard's concept to describe art that multiplies temporal registers, enabling the world to appear as an unfinished project. For Reid, the concept of racial time, understood as political practice, requires an aesthetic component related to our demand for some future moment where we may yet be freer. It insists on possibility in the indicative. Another order is possible. So his related concept of freedom time describes the art of saying the impossible. Reid describes how African-American avant-garde writing creates a formal or aesthetic break where consensus slips away and new thinking breaks through. So in modal terms, freedom time addresses possibility in the subjunctive. It rattles at the past with a what if something had happened or had been possible, and it shakes open perspectives on the present and the future. What if something were to happen or were one day possible? Reid doesn't address Afrofuturist writing, and I don't have space to in this paper either. But Priscilla Lane is your woman on that. Priscilla Lane has argued very persuasively that Wenzel's play Meist in Deutschland und anderen Galaxien resonates thematically with Afrofuturism. And I know that one of her current projects is to explore the Afrofuturist aesthetic in contemporary German writing. I find myself wondering if Adelsraum and Tausend Serpentinen in these particular texts might belong more to what Philip Cavo-Koetzel has called the Afropean contemporary. Even while they explore pasts and futures, which they certainly do, there's a clear and critical focus on a here and now that is contemporary Germany. So I want to look now at how both novels engage with the contemporary in narratives whose chronology moves in coils or loops, so in Serpentinen and Schleifen, where Schleifen will be familiar to those of you who've already read Adelsraum. They're transtemporal narratives, and I'll suggest that one function of transtemporality is to run counter to the politics of racialized time. So on Being White and Other Lies, the politics of racialized time. So on the one hand, race doesn't exist. It's a construction, a fabrication. On the other hand, it exists because it's been constructed or fabricated. Historical conditions of power have required its existence, so that in the words of Wenzel's narrator, die Schwarzen glauben schwarz zu sein und die Weißen weiß. Now, Wenzel's implicitly referencing James Baldwin's essay on Being White and Other Lies, where he argued that whiteness was essentially a matter of belief. People who'd previously thought of themselves, for example, as Norwegians, became white on arrival in the US because of the necessity of justifying the Black subjugation. And African Americans, he goes on, were not Black before we got here either, but came to be defined as their Blackness was defined by the slave trade. The protagonist of Tausend Serpentinen finds that being defined as Black limits her conversational possibilities. Alle wollen ständig mit mir über Rassismus sprechen. Das ist doch nicht meine Lebensaufgabe. The only person who doesn't want to talk to her about racism is her white German therapist. He snoozes through her account of what it's like to be exposed to prejudice-based hate, and then delivers a diagnosis with no reference to her narrative. Sie sind in unserem Land eben eine Minderheit. Sie fühlen sich zerrissen zwischen den Kulturen. Ihre Fragen sind ja im Grunde nicht zu klären. The therapist is invoking what I'm calling racialized time. Racialized time protects existing privilege by declaring it eternal. It naturalizes and fossilizes the present, denying that another order is possible. Like racial time, racialized time is indicative in mood. But where racial time, in Reid's analysis, points to possibility, racialized time declares that resistance is futile. Sorry, that was the slide. And I actually looked up on the internet, resistance is futile, to find where it was first used. And I found an image which I'll just share with you because it fits oddly. So, attending the theatre with her girlfriend, Wenzel's protagonist finds that they're the only non-white audience members in a house packed with white people laughing at racist jokes. They seem kind of trapped in racialized time until a proleptic memory transports the protagonist into a remembered future. Wochen später werde ich eine lange E-Mail an die Regisseurin schreiben und ihr schildern, was im Stück mich angreift. Ich werde sie freundlich darum bitten, sich mit mir auszutauschen. But even transtemporality can be stymied by the politics of white privilege, we find out. Wiederum Wochen später wird sie es vorziehen, mir nicht zu antworten und stattdessen direkt an meine E-Mail anknüpfend ihre moralische Überlegenheit öffentlichkeitswirksam in eine Theaterzeitschrift zu performen. Ich bleibe der erschlagene Fisch. And the violence that constrains epistemic movement is expressed in the protagonist's metaphorical murder, der erschlagene Fisch. That violence becomes overt when the narrator describes witnessing 4 young neo-Nazis loudly using the N-word as an act of violence against a child at a bathing lake. The word is murderous, a Stich mit zwischen die Rippen. But so are the petrifying emotions that assail the protagonist in the remembered past and the remembering present. Ich denke bis heute an diesen Tag, an die Unmöglichkeit, mich korrekt zu verhalten. Rechter Terror ist, ich schäme mich für meine Feigheit. The neo-Nazis at the lake are absurdly stiff, but it isn't funny. Rechter Terror ist, nicht über diese Steifheit lachen zu können. Fear also kills subversive humor, which is a form of epistemic movement. The neo-Nazis' overt racism is shored up by white privilege in a way that's deadening, potentially literally deadening. Excuse me, sir, do you want to murder me or you just want to hate me while you're swimming, says a voice in English in the narrator's head. Now, the du that partners Wenzel's narrating ich intervenes at this moment. Diese Kombination aus Angst und der Unfähigkeit, etwas zu sagen, Ohnmacht, Handlungsunfähigkeit, verstehe. Was tust du dagegen? Es mir bewusst machen? Ich's response is questioning, but it's still very important. As they narrate the story, this partnership of you and I voices collaboratively and sometimes competitively develop a consciousness of how white supremacy works. And that process of naming the nameless is, in Audre Lorde's formulation, the poetic precondition for a future of change. So to start to look at change, necropolitics versus an aesthetic vitality. Later in the novel, Ich tells the story of John Henry, an African-American quarry worker who's remembered for winning a steel driving contest against a steam engine and dying immediately afterwards. Sein Herz versagte vor Erschöpfung. Heute ist John Henrys mein Syndrom, das Menschen befallen kann, die wiederholt seelischen und körperlichem Stress durch Diskriminierung wie Rassismus ausgesetzt sind. The John Henry story seems to resonate with what Achille Mbembe has called necropolitics, where necropower is expressed as the right to cause the death of others. It's murderous. Borrowing from Mbembe, I want to talk about necropolitical time, which racialized time is a subset of. Both conserve or protect power by violently hindering change. So both are petrifying in the somewhat literal sense that they want to arrest movement, turn things to stone. The central section of 1017 is titled Picture This, and it's ekphrastic. And one of the first pictures to be described is the cover image of the Roots album, Things Fall Apart. So Wenzel doesn't show this image, she describes it. It was taken, by the way, in July 1964 during the Brooklyn riots. And you're seeing a young woman running with an expression of horrified terror on her face, and a young man looking back at the white policeman behind them. She seems literally petrified, photographically turned to stone or frozen in time. But still, I'd argue that the album cover, which came out in 1999, is doing something transtemporal that conjures possibilities for movement, so resisting that petrification. The title, Things Fall Apart, points to Chinua Achebe's novel of 1958, an aesthetic engagement with colonial necropolitics in Nigeria, published shortly before Nigerian independence ended British colonial rule in 1960. So time isn't quite as frozen as it looks to be. In Wenzel's novel, life or death are possible outcomes for a young Black person in contemporary Berlin. The protagonist is alive, but her twin is dead. He jumped in front of a train when they were 19 years old, in a context where petrifying violence dominated their childhood. Ich hatte immer so viele Sorgen dich, so viele Albträume, dass die dir was tun. Wie du damals mit dem Messer im Bein heimkamst und dich geschämt hast. Du warst so klein und die haben dich schon so gehasst. So the violent hindering of a Black child, the knife in the leg, is joined with the emotionally and physically constraining forces of shame and fear. In a dreamlike passage, the protagonist walks alone along overgrown, mossy train tracks that are an image of time's passing and the gradual obscuration of memory, and finds her dead brother wrapped in cellophane. As she starts to unwrap him, there's a winding back of linear time. Ein Schwan fliegt rückwärts an mir vorbei. Eine Ameise läuft rückwärts meinen Arm hinunter. But necropolitical time, even when it's running backwards, is no place for possibilities. Würdest du noch leben, she asks, wenn ich nicht runter in die Halle gegangen wäre, mir 2 Äpfel zu holen? And her brother's implicit voice replies, nein. Yet Wenzel also invokes freedom time in repeated insurrections in the subjunctive. The protagonist remembers, for example, how she parted from her various therapists, das ritualisierte Händeschütteln zum Abschied, with the awareness, dass es ein besseres, ein anderes Händeschütteln gewesen wäre, würde es von einer Entschuldigung begleitet. So that past subjunctive rattling at the necessity of what has been. An alternative memory archive is created. She calls it ein Negativarchiv, eine nachfühlbare Sammlung von Körperkontakten, die nicht stattgefunden haben, die aber vielleicht, wahrscheinlich hätten stattfinden können oder sollen. And she imagines challenging her white grandmother to think differently in a thought experiment about what might be speakable. Wie sollte sie reagieren, wenn ich sie fragen würde, ob sie sich vorstellen könne, dass ich natürlich erstmal nichts mit Refugees auf irgendeinem Dach in Kreuzberg zu tun habe, dass ich aber am Ende des Tages doch mit diesen Menschen im Alltag mehr teile als mit ihr, meine Großmutter, nämlich die Tatsache, einem Blick ausgeliefert zu sein, der uns, wenn ich überhaupt von einem uns sprechen kann, als das Gleiche begreift, als das Gleiche markiert, als das Nicht-Weiße des anderen. Thought experiments are particularly important when speaking out risks violence. The protagonist remembers arriving as a supply teacher in a Berlin school, where another teacher welcomes her with a kind of Orientalist enthusiasm, wie toll es für die Kinder sei, dass auch endlich auch mal jemand wie ich sie unterrichten würde. But his enthusiasm wanes pretty fast when she suggests that he should teach the children about Anton Wilhelm Amel to try to make a change from always teaching the achievements of white men. Dann fragte mich, da ich augenscheinlich so eine Expertin sei, ob ich ihm auch Stoff für den Kunstunterricht vorschlagen könne. Denn, also, er frage sich ja beispielsweise, ob es auch zeitgenössische Kunst aus Afrika gäbe, die nicht aus Schrott gebastelt sei. So practice of possibility can always be squashed by empowered nastiness that has a clear intention to silence. Within the narrative, there's no what-if scenario here. But extra-diegetically, Wenzel does offer the reader space to imagine one. What if there were a society where white people didn't defend their privilege with fragility and aggression? Wenzel's protagonist is constrained by the coils of the basilisk of necropower, which she conjures in looping poetic language, Angst vor der Angst, immer mehr Angst, in allen möglichen Situationen, zunehmend auch im Alltag, zunehmend auch vor Menschen. But I want to argue that Serpentinen, like Schleifen, also represent living movement. An Adelsraum is structured according to a coiling or looping principle too. And I've put it into a table here, which of course is linear and doesn't get the coiling movement at all. But I put the colors in so you could see at least the different colored ribbons, as it were, that are the Schleifen that interweave with each other through the different stories in 1459, 1848, 1945, and 2019. For Mbembe, to return briefly to necropolitics, necropolitics are epitomized by the Nazi regime and by European colonialism. And I mention that because the first three loops of Adelsraum describe three necropolitical murders in those contexts. The first Ada is murdered in 1459 by a Portuguese merchant colonizer, Guilherme Fernando Sarco. The second Ada is shot dead in 1848 by Lord William King, a servant of the British Empire. And the third Ada in 1945 by guards in a concentration camp. Junge Mangold has critiqued the novel's fatalism and its portrayal of women as victims. But with respect, I think he's missing a transtemporal point, because Ada is temporally insurrectionary. She defies necropower when she emerges for a fourth time as a child born in Ghana who travels as a young woman to Berlin in 2019. She survives to give birth to and raise a daughter, fulfilling a 15th century prophecy and establishing her own and her daughter's vitality as a counterforce to necropolitics. That's not fatalistic. Like Otto's Schleifen, Wenzel's Serpentinen construct time as looping and flexible, not linear and rigid. Two of the last coils of Wenzel's narrative loop together two moments in the past. On the one hand, the moment 16 years ago, when the narrator saw her grandparents collapse at the news of her brother's death, and on the other looped into it a recent moment at the airport, from which she looks transtemporally into a remembered near future. Gleich wirst du aufstehen und dich in die Schlange zum Check-in einreihen. Dabei wirst du eine Lache Putzwasser am Boden nicht sehen, ausrutschen und hinfallen. Während des Sturzes wirst du dich für einen glühenden Moment so sehr um alles in deinem Bauch sorgen, she's pregnant, dass es keinen Sauerstoff mehr gibt. Du wirst in diesem Moment wissen, dass du das Kind bekommen wirst, dass du fähig sein wirst, es zu lieben, mit der Art von Liebe, die du für deinen Bruder reserviert hältst. So that perspective across time transforms her fear, and she's no longer immobilized because this kind of fear, what you might call Sorge, is mobilizing and vital. Es ist eine Angst tiefer, wärmer und zerreißender als jede Angst um dich selbst, dein Leben, deine identitären Befindlichkeiten es je sein könnte. Eine Angst, gebunden an eine Liebe, so stark wie alles, was du bisher kanntest, mal 1000. So we have two protagonists, Ada and Wenzel's protagonist, whose pregnancy and decision to bear a child kind of moves against the deadening petrification of necro-political time. Now, in what context did I tell you? Oh, I meant to mention that Wenzel's protagonist is autofictional, in which context I wanted to mention this fabulous lecture by Priscilla Lane, Suspicious Spiral, Autofiction and Black German Subjectivity. It's not published as a paper yet, but it is online, and I really recommend it. So Schleifen and Serpentine spiraling as a way of moving forward. Linear time, as Michel Wright has argued in what is probably one of my favorite books ever, Becoming Black, Creating Identity. It's a remarkable, remarkable piece of writing. Wright presents linear time as a fantasy of progress that actually supports constraint and control. It's a linear progression of time and space that starts and stops when those in power want. And it enables the management of memory, which Charles Mills observes that hegemony depends on. The valorization of the present in the context of a past that has been overcome. By contrast with that, circular time, in Kristeva's conception, is women's time that connects past, present, and future generations. But spiraling, I think, is different again. A circle returns to where it started, but the loops of a spiral are simultaneous or coextensive with one another, while also moving forward. You can see the Serpentinen in play here, and transtemporality, as I'm conceiving of it, loops narratively forwards, while developing meaning through the coexistence of temporal loops or spirals. I don't know if can you see my mouse moving? Because I think what's fascinating here is there's an interactive element where you can look back from the past and forward from the present across the loops of time, which isn't possible if you imagine a linear conception. Meaning can therefore accumulate across the loops. For example, the 21st century Ada encounters in Berlin two West African women who resonate with the toothless Greisinnen who raised the 15th century Ada. Wenn sie auch nur einen einzigen Zahn zu teilen gehabt hätten, wäre das viel gewesen. One of the elderly women in contemporary Berlin has poor eyesight. The other struggles to hear. So like the Greisinnen and Ada's 15th century mothers, they too seem connected to the three sisters of Greek mythology who shared one eye and one tooth. And they remind Ada's sister that according to West African custom, she'll be a co-mother to Ada's baby. So we have a European mythological loop coiling meaningfully along a 15th century West African loop, which informs another European loop in 2019, where a West African social arrangement will benefit a child that's yet to be born. It's a very rich conception of time and a very mobile one. If you've read Ada's Psalm, you'll certainly have noticed the signals of connectedness that are sent by the names and numbers that link the cast of characters across the spiral of time. And it's also worth noticing that those connections are never straightforward. For example, across the four temporal loops, we meet Afonso, who's enslaved as a child in the 15th century, Irish Alfie in 19th century London, a concentration camp couple called Al, and a young blonde German called Alphonse in 21st century Berlin. West African Afonso and Irish Alfie are victims of colonial racism. Well, the German couple Al is both a victim in the sense that he's a prisoner in a concentration camp and a brutal perpetrator. And the 21st century Alphonse combines his Ghanaian ancestry with a semi-comical white arrogance. Even Ada is sometimes a perpetrator, as Sharon herself has pointed out in interviews. The second Ada, the English Lady King, comforts herself on a bad day by making fun of potatoes in front of her maid Lizzie, whose parents died in the Irish potato famine. Like Alfonso and Alfie and Al and Alphonse, each of the four Adas, who by the way are black, white, white and black, is in a different relationship with patriarchy and racism that reflects their different positionalities. Ada's transtemporality shows how each person has the potential to be a different person in the different socioeconomic and political circumstances that pertain at different points on the space-time spiral. That's what Maria Lugones, who is probably my favorite philosopher, would call curdled logic, which resists the controlling logics of purity, including linear time. Curdled logic points to the cracks or gaps in empoweredness, which offer spaces for resistance, where power, even colonial domination, she writes, is never total. It's a reminder that counter to the constraining assertions of racialized time, resistance is not futile. Last section, the being in time. Those of you who've read Ada will be familiar, or indeed Herr Gottlob Zetschen will be familiar with the being, the Wesen, who helps out with the narrative. Transtemporal narrative offers a larger scale perspective on time, which can expose and discredit fantasies of linear time and the naturalizing claims to power that it supports. Rita Felsky distinguishes everyday time, which is the way we experience time on a day-to-day basis, from lifetime, which is how we create ourselves as autobiographical subjects, and that from large-scale time, which transcends the limits of our personal experience. So using Felsky's terms, the transtemporal being that co-narrates Adesraum is an observer of everyday time and of large-scale time, and it longs to experience lifetime or to become an autobiographical subject, irgendwann, it says, eine eigene Geschichte haben zu dürfen. It's remarkable among literary narrators for its experience of large-scale time. Its relationship with time has a breadth that far exceeds the capacity of more conventional eye narrators. It's a very unusual perspective. And that matters, not least because a large-scale perspective on time reveals power in its impermanence. When the 15th century Portuguese explorer capitalist Diogo Gomes de Sintra is irritated by a fellow colonizer, the being offers a whistle-stop tour of his further frustrations and fortunes up to and beyond the end of his lifetime. Monate später würde Gomes Zähne knirschen und Guillerme recht geben. Jahre später, gegen Feierabend seines Lebens, würde in seinen Memoiren seine gesamte Entdeckerkarriere in ein vorteilhafteres Licht rücken lassen. Und Jahrzehnte später würde die Geschichte gänzlich vergessen, dass Diogo Gomes de Sintra, Seefahrer, Entdecker und Autor, nie die Suche in der Küstenregion aufgegeben und den Einzug ins Landesinnere vollzogen hätte, ohne Guillerme und seine unverwechselbare Hartnäckigkeit. In the concentration camp, Ada's friend Linda is brutally shoved by a Nazi officer whose hold on power is similarly temporary. He is the being proleptically explains, ein ängstlicher Mann, der die Grausamkeiten Doris nicht ertrug und sich später erschießen würde. So this large-scale perspective on time reveals beautifully that power isn't forever, that you can't set it in stone. So in place of a conclusion to my paper, the yet to be, wir alle sind aber viel mehr, wir alle sind im Werden, says the being. And weiter, weiter, and I've cited a page number, but weiter, weiter, as those of you who've read it will know, recurs over and again in Wenzel's narrative. So following Anthony Reid and Saidia Hartman, I suggested that racial time and freedom time are practices of possibility. And I've sketched the concepts of racialized time and necropolitical time to describe the verbal and physical injustices that produce fear and death as their practitioners cling to power via a politics of petrification. And I've argued that the temporal aesthetics that are modelled in Tausendserpentinen and Adesram open perspectives on the might have been and the yet to be, revealing potential for movement that defies petrification. I've tried to show how the novels reveal the aesthetic and insurrectionary potential of a more dynamic relationship with time. What I've called racialized time, I'm aware, is rather like Foucault's disciplinary time, in that it's historically sought to control subjects' movement in time and space as part of the project of conserving power. But it's also different or more because in its assertion that change is impossible and resistance futile, racialized time also seeks to constrain the imagination. And that makes art and literature really important because resistance to racialized time must needs be expressed as imaginative movement, as practices of possibility, in a way that I think literature and art can perhaps only do it. And I wanted to give my Aydemir the last word. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A lot of silence applause here. So I think we have time for a Q&A here. So we're taking questions. I think I might rather open it up now. So please use the hand function to give us an idea. Okay.
I see Izzy's hand up, if that's helpful.
Oh yeah, that's good. Okay, thank you for letting us know. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much, Professor Colvin. That was really, really interesting and such an interesting new way to read those books. And thank you also, Selma and Lara, for organising this. I've been very excited all week. I just had a question for you about, so my reading of Reid, when I read Freedom Time, what jumped out at me was the way in which the intervention that he talks about comes from a changed nature of reading, and that's sort of what I wanted to ask. So obviously, what you've talked about is how the novels are revealing this insurrectionary potential, and how they kind of through this new aesthetics and this new form of grammar provide this potential. But I just wanted to know, Professor Colvin, what you thought about us as readers and how much of a responsibility we then have to read the impossible from the way that the impossible is said, and how we as readers kind of have this responsibility to take it further. Just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you. That's a really interesting question. First of all, please call me Sarah. Professor Colvin makes me nervous. Yeah, I mean, Reid is an interesting one. There was a postgraduate at Cambridge called Ina Linger, who's now, I think, at Durham, who a few years back came up, and I would find the reference if I looked at it, with the concept of hospitable reading, which I think is a nice concept. And I first of all got interested in it in the context of writing from prisons, which is a different context to this one. But I find there's a very important distinction between what can't be said and what can't be heard. And I'm saying hearing, but reading is part of that. And there's quite often, I think, a focus on what's not sayable, where perhaps in contemporary contexts that think of themselves as democracies, what's not sayable is less of a problem than what's not hearable. And so I think, and I think I've even written about it before, that there's a need to be attentive, which again, it's speaking to your notion of reading, that the leaning forward and listening is probably the only way to continue learning as a human being, to maintain and develop one's epistemic capacity. And I also think, I don't want to kind of sound just sort of serious and self-righteous, it's massively pleasurable. That, I think one of the things that gets to me about art and literature is that it blows my mind, because it's bigger than anything I can think. Because what seems to make the difference between a regular person and an artist or a literary writer is that they are given this magic capacity to tell more of a story at the same time than the rest of us can. When I narrativize something, I reduce it, as we all do unnecessarily. And when I encounter a piece of art that has enabled much more, it does something to my head. And even if it's very serious and painful content, that experience of having my head expanded is very exciting. So that's the long ramble in response to your question. And it's not quite the same as a duty of reading. I think there's almost a duty to lead other people to engage, because they're going to get something massive out of doing it. There is always that movement, and I think that movement's hugely pleasurable. Does that make sense, Izzy?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Oh, and thank you, Claire. Yes, exactly. That's the reference. Brilliant. Different context, but really interesting thinking.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful. Do we have other questions or comments? Yes, thank you. Okay. Sorry.
Hi. This is Brangwyn Stone from the University of Sydney, and thank you for a fascinating talk. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to sign off soon after this, although the rest of the program looks really interesting as well, because it's already evening here. I just had a thought about, I was wondering if, at least in reference to Tausendserpentin Angst, there might be also something thinking about time. I wonder if perhaps also Jack Halberstam's concept of a kind of queer temporality might be sort of interesting as well, if we're thinking about transtemporality, and I guess then queer time rather than racialized time, and also that idea there that there's sort of, he plays with it a lot in terms of a gaze as well, that there's sort of a gaze into a different sort of future elsewhere. I wonder if that, that might also apply, I guess, also to Artersraum to some extent as well, with these sort of different expressions of Arte across different times. But sorry, that's not a very well thought out idea.
No, it's a really interesting addition. Thank you very much, Brangwyn. And what time is it in Australia right now?
Oh, it's only 9 p.m.
Okay, it's not that.
But we're back in lockdown, so it feels very late already.
So racialized time is the petrification moment, the nothing can change. I think the queer time, if I'm getting you right, is more like the freedom time. It's the enabling moment of looking into the future. There's this distinction, this slight and almost implicit distinction that Anthony Reid makes between racial time, which I'm choosing to read as kind of possibility in the indicative, and freedom time, which is possibility in the subjunctive, the what if. But I hadn't thought of Halberstam and queer time, and I've made a note of it, and I think it's a really interesting addition to the thinking. So thank you very much. It's always good talking to lots of different people, because things come in that I hadn't thought of.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Isabel?
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. And I think it also beautiful set the scene because clearly we're getting back to both novels. And so, yeah, thank you so much. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the potential that you're seeing in literature, because that's something I'm also working on. And while I get a sense of where you're going with what you touched upon now, I'm also wondering, but what about the audience? Who are we reaching with literature and potentially film? Thank you so much.
That's a huge question. So I think there's kind of two questions in there. One is, what can literature do? And the other is, in doing it, who can it talk to? And my partner is an artist who has that question on his mind all the time. And so I'm always confronted with it and thinking about it. And I also am inspired and comforted by the quotation that Sharon Dodua Otoo attaches to her emails, which is, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. Which, while I think it's very important for art to talk to the people it can talk to, it can only talk to the people it can talk to. And I think it becomes part of a network that can create change. So I tend to think that, a work of art becomes part of an archive that at a moment in history when change becomes possible is then drawn on. I'm very fascinated when I read really important works of theory. Thank you, Sharon. Exactly. I think that's on my mind all the time as well, that quotation. But I'm fascinated when I read works of theory, and I could name a number of them. What comes to mind spontaneously is Patricia Hill Collins' Black Feminist Thought. It draws on literature. Miranda Fricker, Epistemic Injustice, which was very influential for me and started, again, draws on literature. It seems to me that art doesn't have to change everything in a moment as a kind of single effect, but that there is an archive that art creates, which when there is a moment in history when change becomes possible and when networks have emerged, they draw on it. And it has stored something for them that's really important and enables shifts in thinking that then move. And so the work of art doesn't even necessarily have to communicate directly with everyone. It can communicate via ways. Sometimes art has an idea first and then it becomes theory. And then that becomes law. So, feminist, so women's rights, gay rights, many of these things were articulated in works of art before they were theorized, before they became law. So I think there are complex processes, which is an unfashionable thing to have to explain, because I think there's a strong cultural pressure at the moment to show immediate effects and make things simple. And I suspect that one can't. But I mean, what you said you're working on it, Isabel. What do you think?
I guess I have more questions than answers to my own questions. So I recognize it's a very difficult one. I just really think, especially the fact that Olivia Wenzel's novel is an autofictional novel, I think that plays into that question a lot. And I'll be talking a bit about it in my own talk later this afternoon.
Okay, great. That'll be exciting.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one more question. If anything comes up now.
I've petrified you all.
We have a lot of thinking going on.
Of course, petrification, that's bad.
No, I think we're all moving inside of our heads.
Okay, that's comforting.
Okay. Selma, what do you think?
Hello. Yes, I'll just jump in quickly. Thank you so much for the talk. It was really, really insightful and brilliant. If we do have a moment, I might just ask a quick question of my own. I was interested in it was almost an aside in your talk, but you mentioned the ekphrastic middle section of 1017 Angst. And I was also interested to notice that you used a lot of visual diagrams in your PowerPoint to sort of explain the narrative structures. And I wondered whether you could say a little bit more about this sort of representation of the visual in the text, but then visual representations of the way the texts function narratively, and whether you see a connection between those two things.
Say a bit more. I'm not yet quite sure what you're asking.
I think
Me being dim, sorry.
No, not at all. I'm interested in ekphrasis and different forms of the sort of textual representation of the visual, and I was interested you having mentioned that in the then visual representation of the textual, and I don't know whether that was a conscious decision to use those kind of visual aids. Yeah, an unformulated question, but it's just something that struck me.
It might end up getting an unformulated answer. I'm interested in the question. So, yes, I find it interesting that middle section of 1017, it's autofiction, and that middle section almost has the function, if you read autobiography, there's a middle section of photographs. It's really common for the photographs to be sort of embedded right in the middle of the book. And in the sort of autofictional novel, there's this kind of middle section of described pictures, which is one thing. I think I wasn't consciously addressing that so much as the way I think is in pictures. And so I often have to use images to try and clarify to myself and others what I'm thinking. I am not an effective linear thinker. And so my spiral, I think the first time I explained it to someone made no sense at all, which is why I had to try and find a picture of it to show you exactly what kind of spiraling was in my head. So it's that's an imperfect answer. And I don't think there is, for me, a tidy connection between noticing the ekphrasis in the text and thinking about it in pictures. I think I just need to think about things in pictures.
I might even add something to this. We had a discussion about that the other day, about the middle part, and I wrote about Außer sich and Wenzel. So you will later get only the Salzmann part, but there's also Wenzel part opposed to this, like in comparison. And I wrote about family, and I argued that it was a kind of family album in a way, through the description of the pictures. And I think that Wenzel also thinks in pictures, because every time she introduces a family member, she points at them in saying, picture this. And then she describes it in a very vivid way, like she would describe a photograph, but not a photograph like she does it in the middle part, but more like the real picture in her head, her emotional picture of the family member that kind of has all the details about their personalities. And this is kind of interrelated with the middle part, where she has actual pictures and also this rhizomatic idea. Like, I'm really interested in these kind of networks where she also has pictures of race theory, and also kind of opens up the network of her family, interrelating it with like a bigger frame. So I just wanted to hop in because I'm really interested in this as well.
And one of the other things that both novels do, talking of that central section, is that if one starts drawing pictures and diagrams, as I obsessively do in my head and then on paper, they're both beautifully chiastic. So the Wenzel novel with that astonishing ich-du narration, which is very, very remarkable. And I double-checked this. I was saying to Zama and Laura before, I double-checked this with the narrative list, which has all the experts on narrative theory kind of on it, that nobody has done that before in the way that she does it. But the pattern of it is it goes, the first section is ich-du, the central section is ich, and then it's du-ich. So it's sort of, it's chiastic. And Adesraum is also, if you look at the arrangement of the Schleifen, beautifully chiastic around that central eternity symbol, which is in itself chiastic. So one of my other obsessions, which I haven't talked about today, but I am trying to understand better, is the social model that chiasmus presents. Because to go back to Isabel's question, one of the things I think that literature and art does is to offer forms that could be social forms, could be better social forms. So I think the attention to form is really important because it's actually showing us how we could organize societies better, how we could tell stories better, how we could know things in ways that are better. Yes.
That's really interesting. I hope we come back to this during the day. I think we had a really good starting point here for all the themes and topics that we will be dealing with today. So I would call for another question if somebody still feels the need. Otherwise, maybe we could just leave the room open for a more personal contact, going a bit earlier into the coffee break. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. And we will reconvene then at 12:30 for the first panel. And until then, like Laura said, we'll leave the room open for anyone who would like to remain and chat, if that's possible. Otherwise, thank you so much to Sarah for your fantastic talk and for the conversations we've just had afterwards. And yeah, I think we'll leave it there for now for, is it 17 minutes, 18 minutes?
Something like that. We meet again 12:30. Yeah, thank you so much again, Sarah.
Thank you very much.
Great.
And for the questions.
Okay. Thank you.